Next slide, please. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Suicide Facts, Approaches, and Interventions. This webinar is sponsored by the Northeastern Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, or MHTTC, and we're housed at Rutgers in the School of Health Professions and Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling Professions. My name is Kathy Rivera, and I'm the project coordinator of the center. We'll be introducing our center as well as our webinar presenter today. Next slide, please. The MHTTC is funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, to enhance the capacity of the behavioral health and other related workforces to deliver evidence-based and empirically supported practices to individuals with mental illnesses. Please visit the MHTTC Network website for additional information at mhttcnetwork.org. Next slide, please. And if you're interested in staying up to date with the events and products that the Northeastern Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center is providing, please sign up to receive our email communications. The link that you see on the screen will be shared in the chat box. Next slide. Following the webinar, you'll be asked to complete a brief survey. We value this feedback and use it to improve our activities and inform future activities. These surveys are also important because our continued funding is linked to the completion of these surveys, so we thank you in advance for your feedback. Next slide, please. We also want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our website along with the PowerPoint presentation within a week of this webinar. Next slide, please. This presentation was prepared for the Northeastern Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. All material appearing in this presentation, except that taken directly from copyrighted sources, is in the public domain and may be reproduced or copied without permission from SAMHSA or the authors. Citation of the source is appreciated. Please do not reproduce or distribute this presentation for a fee without specific written authorization from the Northeastern Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. At the time of this presentation, Marian Delphin-Brittman served as Assistant Secretary for Mental Health and Substance Use at SAMHSA. The opinions expressed herein are the views of those speakers and the presenters and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services or SAMHSA. No official support or endorsement of DHHS or SAMHSA for the opinions described in this presentation is intended or should be inferred. Next slide, please. We encourage you to interact with our presenter during this webinar by using the chat feature. Please post any comments or questions you have in the chat, and I will collect your questions as we go and ask them of the presenter during the Q&A time towards the end of the presentation. During the webinar, our presenter may pose questions or polls to you, so please use the Zoom feature to answer these questions. Next slide, please. The MHTTC network uses affirming, respectful, recovery-oriented language in all activities. This includes language that is strength-based and hopeful, that is inclusive and accepting of diverse cultures, genders, perspective, and experiences, language that is healing-centered and trauma-responsive, language that invites individuals to participate in their own journeys, language that is person-first and free of labels, non-judgmental and avoids assumptions, and is respectful, clear, and understandable and consistent with our actions, policies, and products. Next slide. So now let's begin our webinar session. We have Kenneth Kinter with us today. Ken Kinter has worked with people with mental illnesses and addictions throughout his 30-year career. This includes 25 years working in psychiatric emergency settings, partial care programs, and in county jail. Much of this work consisted of doing intake, lethality assessments, crisis interventions, and running therapeutic groups. His current faculty appointment is comprised of 2 different projects, implementing evidence-based practices in psychiatric hospitals and implementing motivational interviewing at several New York, New Jersey service providers as part of the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center grant by SAMHSA. Mr. Kinter is currently completing his EDD, and his dissertation involves predicting and preventing 30-day readmissions to state psychiatric hospitals. He has also published on Lean Thinking, Six Sigma, Deinstitutionalization, wellness centers, and illness management and recovery. He and his wife also operate a therapy practice in Bordentown, New Jersey. In his spare time, he plays bass, sleeps, and spoils numerous animals. So now we'll turn it over to our webinar presenter, Ken Kinter, and welcome again.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate it, Kati. Good afternoon, everybody. So today, this is the objectives of what we're going to be talking about. We're going to start out by a review of recent statistics about suicide. There's a lot of research and stuff here. We may skip over it a little bit, but you'll get to see it. We're going to compare suicide prevalence to other forms of mortality in the United States, see how those trends have gone in recent years, particularly with COVID. It's been interesting. It's sort of changed the direction things were going in. And then we're going to move into more application, where we can differentiate between different types of suicidality, provide some feedback how to help someone that's suicidal, and help be able to build in resources for you and for your agency. Because very often suicide is something that's difficult to talk about. So we want to provide some tips to how to bring that into conversation so that we can identify that. It's really important. This presentation has a lot of resources at the end of it. So there's a lot of things that you can take from it for next steps going forward. So hopefully it's not just a one-time thing, but it's something you can build into what you do. And I forgot to mention, and I should have mentioned, I'm going to be doing this with my colleague, Joni Dolce. She is she's the authority on the vocational stuff. So she's going to be chiming in and out to help us out and help ground this in a little bit more. You've already heard my experience is more emergency room and hospital based. So Joni's going to bring more of the vocational element to it. And Joni, I didn't know if you wanted to say a little bit more about yourself, or if we just
a little bit. Just have been working for a number of years in employment services, currently work within the MHTTC here, doing some work around supported employment, also in the Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation in the Integrated Employment Institute. And yes, Ken is correct. For the most part, Ken will be facilitating the webinar. I may be chiming in a little bit later when we review some scenarios specifically around work.
All right, so Joni, did you want to take us through this poll?
Yeah, Connie's bringing up a poll just so we can get a sense of what your experience is in terms of working with suicidal situations with participants within the ACCES-VR system. Just a simple yes or no, just so we can get a sense of what your current experience level is working with suicidal situations with participants. And Kati will bring up the results once we get a good number. So, okay, it looks like it's almost split. Majority of individuals having encountered some of these experiences. So as we move forward, this isn't a webinar kind of framework. So you're automatically muted, the cameras aren't on, but please use the chat, as Kati mentioned in the beginning. Please use this opportunity. We have 90 minutes together to really kind of hear from Ken, his experience and expertise in this area. And then towards the latter part, like Ken mentioned, we'll get into more specific Voc Rehab. So I'm going to turn the camera off for now, but that's very helpful to kind of get a sense of your current experience level. So we appreciate that. And Ken, I'll let you continue on talking about some statistics and some of the more recent trends.
Absolutely. And I appreciate the feedback and everybody participating in the poll. Those of you who have not been involved in suicidal situations at work, you might want to expect it. It's something that's becoming increasingly common. And that's one of the reasons why we're trying to push back the stigma and get people a little more comfortable talking about it, because it is so pertinent. So just some national and statewide statistics. Suicide is the 12th leading cause of death in the United States. That's what it also ranks in New York State. New York and New Jersey are both at the lowest level of suicide rate among the states. So the suicide rates in New York and New Jersey are about 1/3 what they are in other states. So I think that speaks well to the accessibility of services for those states. But these numbers are very high. We have about 46,000 in the United States in 2020. That's completed suicides. Males complete more often, but women attempt more often. Those numbers have been evening out of late because firearms are becoming the method of choice for suicide, and that has a much higher lethality than overdoses, which women tended to overdose more in years past, but that's changing. Hanging is also quite a common method. Caucasian people complete more than twice as often as the non-white population does, and the age range is over 55. So those are the people that complete, not the most attempts, but the most completions. People that are divorced, widowed, and single attempting complete suicide more often than people that are married. And this one, interesting numbers. Each suicide costs $1 million and directly impacts 10 people, particularly survivors. I think that's a very conservative estimate. Any of you that have experienced a suicide in a school or in your community or in a workplace, there's a lot of indirect impact there. There's like radiating circles of impact that happen in a place. So as far as how it goes in the age range, suicide is the second leading cause of death for people 10 to 34. And then that tends to drop as the population ages and people start to die of other things. But pretty high, second, fourth, ninth, and that's over most of the age range. Now here's some of the interesting stuff that's come up in the age of COVID. The suicide rate had been climbing for years and then just started to level off and drop a little bit. And I'm guessing some of you are already thinking what we're going to talk about later on is overdoses, unintentional overdoses. There's sort of a blurry line between a suicide and accidental overdoses, and we'll discuss that. So in addition to the people who actually complete suicide, there are a lot of people that contemplate it. They make a plan, they make attempts, and that's many more people than the number that actually complete. So it comes out to 1 attempt every 31 seconds and 1 completion out of every 25 attempts. So again, it's something that's going on. And each age group getting younger seems to become more familiar with suicidal ideations or suicidal behavior. Some of the other things that elevate those numbers are people diagnosed with depression, people with addictions, people diagnosed with schizophrenia, people diagnosed with conduct disorder, people with autism, teenagers, enough to say there. That's where a lot of the suicide attempts are. 1 in 12 teens is attempted suicide. And the LGBTIQ plus community is at significantly higher risk, somewhere between 2 and 4 times a higher risk for suicide. And I don't think it takes too long to figure out where that comes from. I would imagine that there's a lot of social pressure. There's some discrimination that happens there. In the case of teenagers, social media has taken bullying to places it's never been before. So I think all of those things help contribute to those higher rates. So looking at this, what we have here, 2 columns. On the left are the top 11 basically killers of Americans in 2020. And on the right-hand side, the same things for 2014, just to look at how these numbers have moved over time. The first thing that jumps out at me is that heart disease and cancer are far and away the 2 largest causes of death for Americans, more than half just between the 2 of them. And we can see the impact that COVID had. COVID went from nowhere to 3rd place, which is pretty significant. And then you could see the rest of that list there. Suicide broke into the top 10, as you can see, in 2014. For the first time, it moved into the top 10 causes of death in the United States. And then it ended up moving back out of the top 10 again due to COVID's presence there. But that doesn't mean that the numbers have gone down. They've continued to go up since 2014. The other thing I wanted to call to your attention in green here are the accidents or unintentional injuries, which have stayed steady at number 4. This also includes overdoses, and you can see those numbers have gone up pretty dramatically. If drug overdose deaths were figured in here by themselves, they would make the top 10 just in and of themselves. And we'll talk a little bit more about those as we go. And again, blurry line between overdose deaths and suicide. Not all overdoses are, so unintentional. So there's a bit of a blurry line between those two. Again, more information about where COVID came in. The purpose of this was to show that the people who had died of COVID weren't people that were expected to die in the next year anyway. They were a whole additional group of people that passed from COVID. And here's the point that I was talking about before. This is the number of overdose deaths in the United States. Fentanyl has taken this into a whole new level. I believe, I've seen conflicting statistics about this, but I believe at least 70% of overdose deaths involve fentanyl. And I've seen data where it's even higher, maybe even as high as 90%, definitely the majority. So I think the point of this is it also stresses the importance of us asking questions about someone's addiction history, as well as asking about suicide. A little bit of a sidelight there. So newer details, there's 6 times more deaths by suicide than car accidents. That's what suicide replaced in the top 10. And more information about deaths by firearm. Some of these are New York statistics. 57% of firearm deaths were suicides, and about 27% of all suicides were by firearms. And New York and California have 2 of the strictest sets of gun laws in the country. So there's some interesting interplay there. One interesting thing, and this is something that Joni found, is that a $1 increase in the real minimum wage is associated with a 1.9% decrease in the suicide rate. So it speaks to the presence of financial stressors as contributing to the suicide rate. And I know there's lots of discussions about minimum wage being lifted. And one unintentional finding is that it does have a positive impact on the suicide rate in the way of reducing it. So the biggest population increases we've seen, men and older women, people who fit the description of baby boomers who are worried about their financial security and their medical well-being, and also have access to medications, veterans and active duty military. And another group that really skyrocketed in recent years that isn't on here are 10 to 14-year-old girls. Again, I think this speaks to the bullying and social media aspect of this. So let's talk about what can vocational rehab staff do? What is your role in all this? I'm sure going into this field, your primary thought wasn't, okay, let's do suicide assessment. But as we know, you end up being sort of a jack of all trades, Jacks and Jills of all trades, in that this is going to come to your door. This is something that you will have to address. I wondered, Joni, if you wanted to speak to that a little bit.
No, I think the poll that we just kind of got earlier really addresses this need for, as Ken is mentioning, and we're going to be talking about, having discussions early on, incorporating materials and resources in the intake or in the initial sessions. Ken will kind of discuss that a little bit. And maybe this is a good time to pause and find out what are some of the current resources that you're all using as vocational rehab staff. What are some of the tools or strategies or resources that you're familiar with when someone is either presenting suicidal ideations or discussions that you have with the person early on? So maybe we can get a sense in the chat. You can type in what are some of the resources that you're familiar with? What is something that you're currently putting in place in your organization? So we'll just maybe take a 30 seconds to a minute just to see what the chat. So you're answering either this question, what can Voc Rehab staff do, or what are you currently doing? What are some resources and tools that you have in place?
So just while you're thinking about that, as someone who isn't terribly involved in Voc, I always pictured the two times that you would be most involved in this is when you're bringing somebody in at intake and you find out that, you know, you're working with them to help them with their job needs, but then all of these other things come up, including, you know, some issues regarding to mental illness, and then also possibly suicide history, suicidal ideations. The other one that Joni and I were talking about is if someone has lost a job, or if they've gone through a series of jobs and they start to lose hope in their ability to work, and then maybe they lose hope kind of altogether in themselves, and then that might lead into suicidal as well. So I'm curious if those examples are something that you've come up against, or if they're complete different ones that we haven't thought of.
We have a couple of chats. One person writes that I have also had to call 911 on a person, and EMTs came to pick the person up. Having an emergency psychiatric hospital, which has a mobile crisis unit, and they can go and pick your person up and take them to the hospital. Caitlin writes, we had a local stabilization center present to our staff recently and have flyers in the office, in the counselor's office, and at the front desk for the suicide helpline, as well as the mobile crisis intervention, so that we have quick access to these resources if we encounter that. Absolutely, that immediate access is so important. Our peer advisor has been very effective, Nancy writes. Trying to coordinate services with the mental health treatment team, making sure they are connected with their treatment team on a weekly basis and taking their medications as needed, also providing them with the psych emergency room resources. Wonderful tool and resource to be mindful of, that integration of clinical and vocational services and how important that is to maintain that integration. Getting a lot now, getting a release to speak with a case manager or mental health provider. So again, that integration of vocational and clinical services, the ACT team, crisis, calling crisis. Yes, so those are some fantastic resources that are already available. Ken will share some additional resources. It looks like the PROS program in conjunction with ACCES-VR. Nancy, I would love to hear you explain that a little bit more, whether it's in the chat or you can raise your hand and Kati can unmute your mic, but how does the PROS program in conjunction with ACCES-VR work? Maybe that would be something of a resource to others who are on the call. I'll give Nancy a minute or two to either unmute or request to be unmuted or type in the chat, because I think that's the PROS programs are the psychosocial rehab outpatient services. I think I may not be getting that 100% accurate, but part of the New York mental health service system includes PROS. So Nancy, if you could share that information, that would be great. We'll just wait a few 15 to 30 seconds to see if Nancy, okay, Nancy, yes. They have groups that address those psychosocial pieces. Yes, so group options for individuals, participants you're working with. Absolutely, thank you. Part-time PROS and part-time access. Okay, so people are participants are able to spend some time attending some groups and addressing some psychosocial concerns, as well as working on employment and vocational services through ACCES. Great.
Very cool. I'm also glad to hear that mobile outreach, that crisis is also something that you can access up there. That's been a big part of the response in New Jersey. And I think that's one of the main reasons why the suicide rate is as low as it is because we go to the people as opposed to, making it incumbent on them to come in and get help, which people don't always do. And of course, that outreach can be real exciting in more rural areas where there's a lot of ground to cover. That's a whole other story unto its own.
And Nancy is following up. Absolutely, this is what the ACT team does also. So
Right.
finding those resources in your community, connecting people, and you also maintain a connection with those staff in the more clinically focused programs.
Yeah, I mean, SAMHSA talks a lot about no wrong door, and particularly they mean no wrong door between mental health and addictions treatment services. But that also extends into vocational services as well. We have people that come in for mental health treatment and for addictions treatment, but they also want to work. And I'm sure that you get people who come in and they want to work, but they also have these other issues that need to be addressed as well. So that's part of why the integration is so important. So as far as being able to talk about these things and get it out right away, the best crisis intervention is crisis prevention. So at intake, finding out about what someone's suicide history is, and we're going to talk about how to do this. Do they have a history of ideation? Do they have a history of attempts? Where are they now with that? And also to start working with that person on their goals. So what is it that they want? You're covering both sides of the street. So what's that old saying? Hope for the best and prepare for the worst. So you're covering both sides of that. But it's critical to know right at the beginning where someone is regarding suicidality, so that the first time that you're talking about it isn't when there's a crisis. Now, if it's the first time you're seeing them and it's a crisis, that's unavoidable, but you don't want to be surprised later on.
So Ken, just to kind of follow up on that a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
what is your sense? I'm asking the group here, and you can unmute or request to be unmuted or type in the chat. How does that feel, having these discussions early on? How does the thought of having a discussion about this at intake, at first meeting the person, what are some of your either concerns or thoughts about having these early on discussions? Does anyone have sort of a reaction or thought about this? Whether it's, are you currently doing that? Does it, what feels awkward about it potentially, maybe not? What feels surprisingly useful about having that conversation? Difficult to ask people about this when we were just meeting and do not have the report yet. Yes, and I think when we talk about kind of the putting it all together at the end of this session, we are going to talk about how to bring this up, how to feel more comfortable talking about this. I absolutely, it could be a potentially difficult thing to address with someone or talk to someone about when we're just meeting them. Ken has some suggestions on how to have that discussion early on. What are some others' thoughts about having these early discussions? Nancy, for instance.
Oh, go ahead.
Yep, Nancy's writing, for instance. Let's see. One of our intake questions is about legal history, and that tends to turn people off. So the fear may be turning people off, not developing the relationship, harming the relationship building. Caitlin had to reach out to an applicant once to do a wellness check based off the way that he completed the application and wanting to end his life, and turned out he was not suicidal at all, but it was definitely uncomfortable. So having to have that uncomfortable discussion, certainly all valid reasons why you may not want to harm or potentially harm that relationship. And I think, Ken, you were going to talk a little bit about how to have that discussion in a way that builds the relationship or does not diminish that relationship that you're wanting to build with the person.
Absolutely. We'll definitely go into that when we get more into application.
One more chat. Sorry about that.
Uh-huh.
I feel sometimes as a professional, it feels uncomfortable more for us, but from feedback that clients give, they actually feel more safe that they have someone to reach out to. think that's
You're reading my mind. Most of the discomfort does come from us because we don't want to ask those questions. You know, the person is where they are. They've either had a history of attempts or had a history of ideation or haven't. They are where they are. The discomfort tends to come from our side. Um, and there was the old belief back in the day, and I shouldn't say back in the day because it's still around, and that is that we can't talk about it or we'll make that person suicidal. I'm sure you've heard that at some point, and I thought it was long gone, but it's still out there. Um, you know, no one has ever been made suicidal by someone saying the word suicide around them. In fact, by us being comfortable enough to bring it into the room, we actually add a level of comfort to the conversation. You know, is the person going to be able to trust us to be able to tell us about where they've been in terms of suicidality? And again, we get a little later on, we'll talk about some little tricks that might make it easier to bring this up, and also a structure to bring it up in. So as far as the information here, we just want to break out that not all talk about suicide is the same, and sometimes things get misinterpreted. When I worked in the emergency room, we would have children that would lose their grandparents and they would say, "Oh, I want to be with grandma or with grandpa." And then boom, next thing you know, they're in the emergency room because people were thinking they were suicidal and they really just wanted their grandma or grandpa back, which is understandable. So as we move down this list here, we move into from areas of lower concern to areas of higher concern. So what I just described was the death wishes. You know, it's not uncommon for people to feel like they wish they were dead. Something terrible happened and they want this pain to stop. So they wish for death. Not a lot of talk about any active role in it or what they're going to do. So it's sort of passive. Hopelessness. And as important as hopelessness, maybe even more, is something called anhedonia. And anhedonia, if you think of the word hedonism, anhedonia means absence of pleasure. So if you think about the things that you do that make you feel good, holding your child, fishing, whatever, gardening, whatever does it for you, imagine doing that thing and feeling nothing, just an absence where that feeling of joy would be. That's something that really pushes people in the direction of being suicidal. And then we have suicidal thoughts. And again, thoughts are just that. People tend to use the word fleeting thoughts, where it kind of passes on through. They've had the thought, but it didn't stay and they didn't really seriously consider it. Thoughts are different from ideations. Ideations is when you're starting to work on the circumstances. How would I do it? When would I do it? You're starting to work on specifics, not quite to the level of a plan, but almost, oh, hypothetically, this is what I would do. And it's like a trial and error kind of thing where a person thinks about, oh, no, I wouldn't do that. Maybe I would do this instead. Where things start to get interesting is where a person has a plan. They know what they would do. People tend to have a method figured out. And then if something happens with that method, they have to start over again. You know, the argument behind putting all of these physical barriers on bridges. If someone wants to jump off a bridge and they come upon the physical barrier, they don't automatically go to another method. Now they have to start all over again. So that's an idea of one of those things. So a plan. There's also intent. Intent is when the person does something with the intention of it will kill them, which might be different from what we call parasuicidal behavior, where if you're going to take pills and then call poison control, or take pills and then tell a family member, the intent means I thought this was going to kill me. And this gets exciting, especially in the area of taking pills, because some people might think that taking things that are over the counter, like Tylenol, might not be very lethal, when in reality they are. And then there are other prescription medications that are relatively harmless. So intent is almost a matter of perceived intent rather than actual intent. Did you think this was going to kill you? Or do you think this is going to kill you? And then the other issue is access. Do they have access to medications? Do they have access to the bridge? Is the plan that they're talking about something that can actually be done? Other things that you want to ask about with that person is their history. Is it in their family? Is there a history of suicide attempts or suicidal behavior in family? This is notoriously underreported. You go back a few generations, families, people didn't talk about this stuff very much. If you had a family member that completed suicide, you might never hear about it. There might be a whole other story of what happened to that person. The other thing that you're going to want to get to know about that person is, are they impulsive or are they a planner? Is this a person where something bad is going to happen to them and they're immediately going to have thoughts about suicide and act on it, even if they're going to regret it 5 minutes later? Or is this the kind of person that will stop taking their medication and start hoarding it up, or start putting their affairs in order and spend weeks or months putting something together so that the plan is ready? Different people have different methodologies about how they do these things, and you want to know that about the person. So getting back to suicidal intent.
And we have a question in the chat
Oh,
from Michelle. How does family history play into this?
There is research that shows that people that have suicides in their family are at higher risk themselves. I don't know if that's hereditary or environment. I don't want to make a statement about that, but it does seem to travel in families. I do know there's a strong environmental factor. I worked in the emergency room when there were several high-profile suicides. Kurt Cobain was one of them, and we had swarms of people coming in after that. The state hospital where I worked when Robin Williams killed himself, the patients were really moved by that. They loved his movies, and they were familiar with his own battles with mental illness and addiction. And then for him to complete suicide was a real blow for them. So yeah, if it is in the family, I would consider that a risk factor, an additional risk factor for them. But I would also consider it if it was a friend or someone in their peer group or someone they looked up to as well. So I don't know if I would consider it, in addition to that. So regarding intent, one of the other reasons why this is so important is lethality assessment is a highly imperfect science, first of all. And the other piece is, if you're just meeting someone, they're probably not going to be 100% honest with you about how severe it is. So my rule of thumb always is, it's worse than you think it is. There's always some aspect of it they're not telling you. So whatever they're telling you, especially at intake, there's probably something more there. So what this information says, it's the intent that they state, plus what you get from them, what your gut tells you, and your gut is very important. And then what they hold back from you. They might not tell you that they've got a loaded weapon at home. They might not tell you that they already have the pills saved up just in case. They're not going to give that to you right off the bat. My experience as a clinician is that people always give you a presenting problem first, but not the presenting problem. I'm going to give you this presenting problem first to see if you can handle it. Then we'll get to the big one later on down the road. So to me, vocational needs is a perfect thing. Like, oh, what I really need is a job because I have these financial stressors, this, that, and the other. But meanwhile, behind that, there might be a lot of other stuff that you might not even get to. So I always assume it's a little worse than what I'm hearing. And a person is very likely not to tell me the worst of it, specifically severity of past attempts or current method. Those are the two things that I've kind of seen the most. So also among the layers in assessing suicide, we have to look at different things that are going on with that person. So what's going on with them right now? Very often in crisis, I heard the term, the straw that broke the camel's back. People that have probably never seen a camel in their entire life are very familiar with the saying, straw that broke the camel's back, because it's like you can handle all of the things that are going on in your life, and then this one thing happens and it's just too much. This is the one that sets you off. So those are very often the things that we're looking for. What's that thing that just says, okay, this is too much? But then we also have to look back at what's been going on for the last 6 to 8 weeks, what's been setting the stage for where we are right now. And then looking back over that person's life and their history of attempts in the past, as we'll see, when we move forward a little more. We're always looking for things from the past to come up again too. So a couple other points to bring up. Self-mutilated behavior is not necessarily suicidal. You will come across people who have cut themselves and burned themselves, and it may appear suicidal, but it may be more in the service of them just expressing emotional pain. That person may not have had any intention to kill themselves whatsoever. As we mentioned before, we want to discuss suicide openly and seriously, like we discuss everything else. You cannot make someone suicidal by what you say to them. They've either had it or they've not had it. You can't make that part happen. Also critical, not to keep any of this to yourself. No secrets. There may be people who say to you, look, don't tell anybody, but you don't want to be in that position. You don't want to be keeping that, to yourself. And depending on what your job is or your license or what your situation is, you may be legally obligated to respond as well. It's always good to consult your supervisor or to talk to one of your colleagues. I've noticed that when I'm stuck on something, by the time I'm done telling that story to someone, like a peer, like a supervisor, before they even say anything to me, I already know what I'm going to do. I just hear myself saying it and I go, yeah, you know what? This isn't as close as I thought it was. The other critical piece of this is using direct language. This one I was guilty of as a young clinician. I had an aversion to saying, are you thinking about killing yourself? And I would say, are you thinking about hurting yourself? Well, that's a problem because again, that doesn't cover this self-mutilative behavior and it's wishy-washy language. The best way to deliver it, and we'll talk about a way to cheat on this a little bit, is just to ask, are you thinking about killing yourself? Have you thought about killing yourself in the past? But we'll talk about a couple of those other methods to address that. So when we were talking about this, this presentation, and one of the things we were thinking about is what's something that you can take from here and build right into what you do so that you can use this in your own work. So the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale is a resource that I've used in emergency room settings, in the state hospital settings, and elsewhere. I really like that this is a quick, direct, simple way to assess suicide in someone. So if you take a look at these questions, first of all, it almost couldn't be shorter. It's somewhere between 3 and 6 questions long, depending on the answer that you get. And if you look at the color-coded answers here, you can build in what your process or what your procedure is going to be, depending on what someone answers. Because most of these are, they're yes or no questions. So they're pretty direct, to answer. So have you wished you were dead or wished you could go to sleep and not wake up? Again, this is passive, more on the low end of the lethality scale. Have you actually had any thoughts about killing yourself? And if the answer is no, you go directly to 6. And that 6 is, have you done anything or started to do anything or prepared to do anything to end your life? These are sort of more moderate risk. If they answered yes to question 2, then you go through 3, 4, 5, and 6. Have you thought about how you might do this? Here's where we get into the ideation, plan. Have you had any intention of acting on these thoughts of killing yourself, as opposed to you've had the thoughts, but you definitely would not act on them? This is intent. And have you worked out or begun to work out the plans of how to kill yourself? Did you intend to carry out this plan? And here's where we get into, the plan itself. So I've seen organizations who have literally cut and pasted this and put this in their intake paperwork so that this gets covered right off the bat. And then you also have your plan. So if you're the intake person and you're talking to this person and they've given you an answer that you're not comfortable with, what's your procedure? When someone gives you, say, an orange answer on here, or a red answer, what's the plan? Do you go to your supervisor? Do you speak to a licensed person? What move do you make as a result of that? So that way, I think that the decision tree is very easy. So the Columbia is also open source, so it's free to use. They have free trainings. I know they have them online. COVID made them all online. They were doing them in person as well because they trained us in emergency on them. They have multiple versions of the Columbia. There are some that are geared more for healthcare settings. There are some for family and friends. They have different versions for a version that you might do with someone on intake, or that you might do on discharge, or if you have concerns about someone's lethality during the way, along the way. So they have a lot of different options about that. A couple
And
other. Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, there's a question in the chat. Do you suggest we ask all our participants or just the ones with a mental health diagnosis? It's a great question.
I would ask everybody. I would make it routine. One, for reasons of stigma. Two, as we're finding out now, people with addictions are every bit as likely, in fact, maybe even more likely, to kill themselves intentionally or otherwise. And of course, there's a lot of gray area in the middle between those things.
And Ken,
So I would make it across the board.
Just a follow-up. Though some people in the chat earlier had mentioned feeling discomfort, or how would you ask that? How might someone ask those questions on the Columbia scale in a way that doesn't harm the relationship, or in a way that doesn't push the person potentially back from you?
Absolutely. There's a couple different ways to do it. And, maybe your style dictates whether one of these is better for you or the other. One is the official, what I'm going to do with you now is something called the Columbia Suicide Scale. We do this with everyone. I'm just going to ask you a few yes or no questions, and please answer them honestly. That's the very business-like model. The next model is basically the safety first model. Said, look, we just met. We're going to be working together regarding your vocational needs. But the most important thing to me is that you're safe and that you're okay. So I want to ask a couple questions to you just to see where you are, safety wise. The other example that I would do, this is sort of, I don't want to say sneaky, but sneaky way to do it is, if during your discussion with someone, you've asked them about psychiatric history, addiction history, all this other kind of stuff. If that person has said anything about depression or addiction or anything, you can use that as a link, and you could say, look, I heard you say before that you were depressed. And I know that a lot of people, when they're depressed, sometimes they have thoughts about killing themselves. Have you ever had thoughts about killing yourself? So did you see how I sort of transitioned it? I took the thing that they said and just fed it in. So I would say those are three different ways. One is the official, here's this cool Columbia thing, we do this with everybody. Number two is safety first, because how do you argue with safety? The reason I'm asking this question is I want to make sure you're okay. I want to make sure you're safe before we can talk about job and any of these other things. You need to know that you're okay, and that's important to me. So there's that. Sounds like much more of a Carl Rogers approach than the official approach. And then the third one would be, if you've done an intake and you've already discussed all these things, I would take anything that they've said that you might consider would be a risk factor. History of addictions, history of mental illness, even history of severe medical problems. One of the big reasons that people contemplate suicide is that they're not in good physical health, and they may not be, too happy about their life going forward from there. And then use that as a, some people in that situation have had thoughts about hurting themselves. If you had thoughts about killing yourself, that sort of thing.
And
So-
Ken, the benefits of bringing this up early on, just to reiterate what those are what are some of the benefits that you've seen in your practice when you would bring this up early on?
People that you don't think are thinking about it have thought about it. It's always a little deeper than I think it is. And once it's out in the room, then it's out in the room. Like, you don't have to go back and do it again. Now it's out there. The problem that I have with waiting until the relationship is better, first of all, there's a risk involved in that, because sometimes people are in a very delicate place when they come into treatment. But I find it harder to bring it up later because I've skipped it already. So to me, that makes it difficult.
Ken, you also mentioned when you're asking in the initial session with someone, do you also say something along the lines of, if some of your responses are concerning or indicate potential suicide behavior, however you want to frame that, do you also, right in that very first session, say there may be some follow-up that would need to happen? Or
Yeah. The basically the, I need to know you're okay. You know, you're in here, I'm working with you, and I need to know that you're okay. If I don't feel like that you're safe, then there may be steps I have to take. I might have to talk to somebody. I may have to talk to a supervisor. I might have to talk to someone who might have additional questions for you. They may know this deal already. They may have gone through this already. They may have already had to work with ACT team or crisis. They may have already come through a hospital, so they may know that. And believe me, that's another disincentive for them to be 100% honest with you. If they've been in that situation before, they're going to come to any sort of mental health provider with a little bit of hesitation. You know, I've had many clients come to me and say, well, if I told you what was really going on, you'd call the police or you'd put me in the hospital. And I almost have to reassure them. I said, look, the only time I'm going to take any sort of steps is if I don't feel like you're safe. That's the whole ball game. You know, safety is first. And I just keep going back to that over, you know, and over again. If they're coming to you for work, they obviously want some sort of safety. I mean, they're trying to move forward in their life, but that doesn't come without, you know, without some level of risk.
maybe now is a good time to pause and ask if there are any questions or what questions people might have at this point. It's about 5 to 2, so we have some time. What questions so far do you have for Ken in terms of the Columbia tool, or how to discuss this? What are some of the words to say? What are how to bring this up in the initial meetings? Maybe we'll give people 30 seconds or so to respond and ask some questions along the way.
I would definitely encourage anyone who has some any questions about the Columbia. There are videos that you can pull down right online and take a look at it, and they'll take you through it in a lot better job than I did taking you through it. I just wanted to show it to you and see if it was something that you would be interested in.
Okay,
there are other versions of them as well. To me, the Columbia is the quickest, shortest, and cleanest way to do it. And I've been amazed at what I've learned about people. It's funny how when you start a discussion and it includes suicide, where it goes. Very often they'll talk about family things, or you'll get a much better look at what's going on in their history.
Ken, we have a couple of comments. Nancy's asked, stating, I would feel very uncomfortable using this with our high school students. Any response to that?
There is a version of this for schools, specifically for schools, and there are also other versions that are geared more toward school populations. So there are other, actually, my wife is the one who's more knowledgeable about resources for children and adolescents, so that might take some follow-up on my part. But there are other versions of it. I would tell you that the adolescents that you would talk to are probably more familiar with suicidal ideations than the adults are. Each generation is more and more familiar with it, so they're already there.
Any more questions or comments before we move on?
All right. All right, so we wanted to throw a couple hypothetical scenarios at you to think about, you know, how you would respond in a given situation. So here we have the situation of Jason. He arrives in your office looking very disheveled. He just got fired and he's saying some things that are concerning you. He isn't directly stating that he plans to hurt himself, but he's making suggestions, saying things like, I might as well give up. They were right to fire me because I'm worthless. So if you could put in the chat, what would your response be to this? If Jason's somebody that you've been working with, he isn't directly stating that he plans to hurt himself, but he's saying things about giving up. They were right to fire him. I'm worthless.
You can either raise your hand or write in the chat, whatever is easiest for you in this format. Rukmini identifies a strengths approach. Maybe if we're getting lots of Rukmini, let's work on what he's good at. Okay, so identifying those strengths. So Rukmini, what types of questions might you ask to get at what his strengths are? What are some things that you can talk to him about? I'll give you a minute to respond while we look at what others. Michelle, explore those thoughts with him, ask him to elaborate. Let's work on what he's, okay. I may ask him about the support he has currently, or a mental health counselor, or a family, maybe a jogger, like remember that time. Find out if he is receiving mental health services at that time. You fixed so-and-so and everyone thought you did a great job. Other times he's done well, so maybe pointing out some of the skills that he's obtained and some of his strengths, reminding him how folks have responded in the past.
That's good. I've heard some great stuff so far. You want to find out how deep this well goes. Like, where is he? What's the part? Like we were talking before, here's what Jason's saying. What's the stuff he's not volunteering right off the bat? You know, does he have medication hoarded up at home? Does he have a history of potential lethal suicide attempts? Again, if we've asked Jason all of this before, we already know, because there's a difference if Jason has never tried to kill himself before. Not that we treat that more lightly, but we take his lack of history into consideration, as opposed to he's been on the ICU 4 times for, suicidal behavior. One other thing I forgot to mention before was another way of bringing it up is just by asking someone one sentence. What's the closest you've ever come to killing yourself? What's the worst it's gotten? So you kind of find out where that rock bottom is for them. And then you can find out when that was. Was that recent? Was that a long time ago? So that gives you another idea of where where that person is. That's another approach.
Emily's writing, assess what supports and resources he has for mental health, as well as family and friends. Check safety. Is there a plan or a means?
Yeah. Yep. I want to know what a support network is, professional and personal. You know, if this is someone who lives by themselves and doesn't have anyone and they're not in any treatment, that's a different ballgame than, oh, they've got a therapist, they've got a case manager, there's other people involved, you know, family, pastor, supportive neighbors, people in a group home, whatever you got, you know, whatever's in your safety net. Linking with other services is a great suggestion, because again, you know, working on the vocational side, that's part of the hard part about being in mental health. You kind of feel like you're all things to all people. So if you have a nice team, you can reach out to who's the person's therapist, who's their psychiatrist, who are the people that are helping them for specifically this situation. And then I like the idea of trying to redirect into their goals. You know, because ultimately we want him to keep trying. You know, we don't want this to be the end of him. You know, if we don't want this to get to the point where he's like, well, I'm going to give up on this work thing now. It's not even going to work.
Another response, I would ask him about the whole situation, ask him if he is interested in knowing the reason why he was fired, and follow up with the employer, and ask how he would like to move forward, and if mental health is something he is already connected to, or if interested in connecting. So finding out if there's already supports in place. So Ken and I had asked a couple of questions. We were thinking of some other questions to generate discussion. So what are you hearing? What are we hearing from Jason? What what are we hearing from this very brief scenario, but he's saying some things. What are we hearing from him?
Yeah, we're getting a lot of hopelessness out of Jason.
Yeah, he's frustrated. He may be
Mhm.
considering giving up.
Yeah. Yeah. I really like the suggestion
Yeah.
that was made about finding out more about why.
Hopeless, may
think
not
it's
see
cool.
other options.
Mhm.
Ken, I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Finding out
Yeah.
about,
Yeah, finding out about what happened. Because what if this is just a bad fit? I'm sure we've all had jobs at one point or another that just didn't fit with who we were, what we wanted, or what our values were. Um, so it's just not going to work. And it
another
doesn't have to be our
response,
fault or the job's fault. It's just the mix wasn't good.
hearing he's angry currently and does not know where to go from here. Absolutely,
Mhm.
we're hearing that. Now, Ken, where in this scenario, if you were to expand on this, what would we be hearing from Jason to put up some alerts, some red flags, some concerns?
Yeah, that was the next question I was going to ask the group. Like, what would Jason say that would make you go, okay, I think this is moving outside of just you and I talking here. If I heard him give specifics, specifics about what he was going to do, if he was talking about cutting himself or if he was talking about pills or, something like that. When, he does say give up, but he doesn't give any sort of specifics about that. If I started to hear things that were more specific, if I hear no future plans, is there any sense of what happens next? Now, obviously, Jason's entitled to, feel bad for himself to a degree, to feel sad or to feel angry for a bit. He's entitled. That's fine. It's fine to validate that, But then what's next? What's the next move? Does Jason see any sort of future? Vocationally or otherwise. If I start hearing those other things, that's when I'm going to start saying, okay, I've got to, at some point I got to reach out to somebody. I either have to talk to somebody where I work, I got to consult with someone where I work, or, obviously if Jason gives us anything overtly suicidal, then we're talking about the emergency response mechanism that you guys have in place.
Another question that you and I kind of talked about prior to this was, what if Jason says he is going to go home and cut himself or take pills?
Mhm.
Then what? What would be the response then? And maybe
Well,
bringing that up to the group.
So yeah, we'll bring that to the group. So in our case in New Jersey, we are mandatory reporters, which means we are obligated to respond to that. And I'm fine with being overt and direct with Jason about that. In fact, that's one of the other nice reasons about bringing this up at intake is that it's understood right off the bat. Look, I'm not willing to let you walk out of here and just go home and kill yourself. In fact, my stock line is, I would rather you be alive and angry at me than dead because I didn't say something. So that's always my stock line. I would much rather you be alive and angry at me. I'm not okay with, and it's not consistent with my job to just let you leave here to go kill yourself. If I don't think you're safe, there are things I have to do to try to help you to be safe. Because I want this to continue. I want us to keep working together.
Are there other scenarios that the group have encountered over the, in the past, in your job here or in previous positions that sound similar to Jason, or maybe different, but you would want some feedback from the group here and from Ken?
I'll give you another scenario while you're thinking about that. So let's just say Jason arrives at your office looking very disheveled, and he's also very drunk, or he's obviously under the influence of something. How does that change your approach with him? Scenario one, he's clean and sober and in front of you and obviously hurt and angry and, frustrated. Scenario number two, he's under the influence. How does that change your discussion with him? Does that make you think he's in a less dangerous place or perhaps in a more dangerous place?
Nancy's asking, how did he get there? Driving?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Emma,
Driving makes that one pretty easy, right? If he drove drunk to you, then he's laid that out pretty clearly, right? Because then we're not only concerned about his dangerousness to himself, but we're concerned about his dangerousness to other people as well.
Ken, what makes having, if someone is intoxicated, more of a danger? What is the reason for that?
Well, particularly alcohol, it takes people from a place of where they're thinking about it to they're actually willing to try it. I don't know what the data is about the percentage of suicide attempts that have alcohol involved. To my experience, it's over 50%. It's disinhibiting. And there are other things that are disinhibiting too. Xanax, there are other types of medications that are disinhibiting so that you are more likely to do something. Some of us may have some experience with saying or doing things while drunk that we wouldn't do sober. I don't think that there's nothing different about that when it comes to suicide. So to me, that would make him not only more dangerous, but also make his report less reliable. Because again, if you're talking to somebody who's drunk or high or a combination of the two, at that point you might be talking emergency services. Like, you should have this discussion again when you're clean and when you're sober, when you're clear-headed with someone.
Wendy, we had a couple of responses here in the chat. Intoxication, Emma writes, lowers inhibitions, impulsivity, perhaps. Wendy writes, they try to get him to agree with getting substance abuse treatment so that his hopelessness does not increase. We have programs that will pick someone up for inpatient treatment if needed. So yes,
that's fantastic.
As people mentioned earlier, kind of having those resources right at your fingertips, readily available when you are presented with a situation like this. And we have another comment here: after one drink, you are impaired and increases your risk.
Yeah. I mean, the disinhibition process doesn't start at inebriated. Plus, you have no way of knowing if someone comes in smelling like alcohol. You can't assess right there, are they legally intoxicated or not? You just may smell it and be aware of that. And again, I don't know, this isn't necessarily part of this conversation, but what percentage of people that you work with who have a mental illness also have an addictions diagnosis? I can only speak for the hospitals. It's about 70% in the hospital. So it's the majority of people you're working with. I would not be greatly surprised to hear that not be so different, where you are. No, that's really good. It sounds like you have a lot of services that help support you in what you do. And that's really, really important because, most of the people that we work with have multiple domains of problems. They may have a psychiatric disorder. They may have an addictions diagnosis. They may have medical problems that may have to do with the addictions disorder. They may have legal problems. And then, of course, the challenges that they're facing vocationally that brings them to you. So you need that backup because you can't be, in charge of all of those things. So that's really sharp. So again, I think that the big takeaway from my side here is that you as an individual and the place where you work are very clear about what the policies and procedures are about how to do this going forward. And mine, my recommendation would be to build something like the Columbia into what you do, to address it at first meeting at intake so you can get an idea of what someone's background is. so that you know what their crisis may look like before you get there. Because if you're working with that person for a while, you probably will eventually get there. There are a number of ways of initiating this, as we've talked about, where it's procedural, coming from a safety perspective, coming from the perspective of just wanting to make sure that that person's okay. And so that you're ready, so that you're prepared if something happens, you'll know about it. You'll have an idea where that person is at risk. So just in terms of, let's see what we're doing time wise. So suicide it's continuing to increase. It's right around the lower end of the top 10 causes of death in the United States. I have no reason not to believe it will re-enter it shortly. Hopefully COVID will be on its way out of that top 10 list. There's a blurred line between intentional suicides and accidental overdoses. Accidental overdoses are skyrocketing, but again, there's a real blurred line between those two. There are certain populations that are at higher risk. Suffice to say that if you're working with someone that has a mental health diagnosis such as depression or bipolar disorder or addictions, that's a sign of a higher risk. There are different levels of suicidality. Just because someone says something about suicide doesn't mean they're at risk now. It may have been a long time ago. It may have been a particular situation they were going through in their life. Or it may have been that lower end of just having a death wish or a fleeting thought. There are some people, when bad thing happens to them in their life, they just have a fleeting thought about suicide, but it never stays with them and it never sticks. Talking about suicide is critical, both early in the relationship and in times of crisis. I definitely understand the concern about going there, but it's really critical to go there. You actually establish safety by going there. You make the statement, I'm comfortable going there. I'm secure in what my job is, and I can go here with you. People may not tell you exactly how suicidal they really are. And it's always better to talk to a person about it than avoid it and hope they are okay. And then a couple of these last points in closing: don't keep secrets. If someone wants to say, well, I'll tell you, but don't tell anyone else, that's not a deal you can keep. Make sure you consult with people who are, your supervisors. Who is it that you go to talk to about what's going on with you? One of the reasons that we bring this topic up is there is such a high rate of suicide among people with mental illness. I believe with the diagnosis of schizophrenia, there's a 1% completion rate. If you've been working in this field for a while, someone that you are working with will either make a very serious suicide attempt or may complete suicide. And it's a devastating thing to deal with. I've had it happen a couple times over my years in the field. And you end up having two pretty strong sets of feelings at the same time. One is overwhelming sadness because of what's happened to this person and their life has ended. But then the other question you go to is, what could I have done? Did I do everything I could do to help keep this person safe? And if your answer is yes, I did everything I could do, and unfortunately this happened anyway, that's a lot better than I should have told somebody, or I should have. You don't want to have any of those. You don't want to look yourself in the face and see any of those shoulda, woulda, couldas. So I think that's one of the other reasons to really make this important to bring it up right at the beginning. So this presentation has a lot of different resources attached to it. A lot of the data that we got came from suicidology.org. The Lighthouse Project, this is the website again for the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale. There are trainings called Mental Health First Aid, and there's also Youth Mental Health First Aid. It's been referred to as CPR for suicide. We threw in some suicide prevention hotlines here. The New York State Office of Mental Health, of course, has their own suicide prevention website, which is on here. And we also, if you look at the website here at sites.rutgers.edu, we have about 30 trainings up there that you can take. There are certificates of attendance that you can get. There are post tests. I did a bunch of them. There are some on addictions, various mental health topics, being able to run groups, all sorts of different areas. Smart recovery. We're working on more of them all the time. So it's a free resource. You're welcome to use and access those at any time. And then, of course, I'm just looking to see if there's any other resources on here besides the one we talked about. All right, and then with the time left, we'll throw it open for questions and answers. Is there anything that we should have covered that we missed, or anything anybody wanted to bring up?
Yeah, we have about 10 minutes to field some questions, get some answers from Ken. Please use the chat or unmute your mics, whatever is most useful for you.
Mhm. If there was one other point I was going to add, just while you're thinking about that, is and this is going to sound a little strange, but stay with me. Think of suicide as a symptom. Suicide is a symptom of depression. It's a symptom of addiction. It's a symptom of a lot of different things. You would ask your clients about other symptoms. You would ask them about their depression. You would ask them about their anxiety. You might ask them if they've been, clean and sober for a period of time. Just treat it like it's another symptom, that we do need to know about as part of being able to care for them and help them accomplish what they want to accomplish, work-wise and life-wise. And now I'll shut up in case there's any questions coming on.
Okay, Janelle has a question. In my experience working with youth, they're very comfortable talking about it. I have seen youth who have created pacts.
Yep. I would actually gauge that children and adolescents are more comfortable talking about suicide than adults are. They probably have more experience with it on a life level. They may not know the parts like we were discussing, like what have you do and the clinical aspects of it, but they have discussions about it. My wife is the person who works with more children and adolescents, but I've gone and responded to a few schools with her before. Those kids are conversant. They know it. In a way, I almost wish they didn't know it, but at the same time, knowing about something when you're young, to me, I don't know, that's how you learn about how something responsibly as you know about it. Keeping people ignorant about something doesn't help. We were way too quiet about suicide for way too long, and that didn't help us very much.
Wendy is making a comment. So I think this is really important to hear, not just listen to what the individual is saying in order to determine if this is a serious issue and what steps you should take.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, is the person just venting? Are they venting frustration on you? Or is this something that they really need attention with? And that's the question about just asking if someone's safe. Are you safe? Are you okay? Do they have someone to go to? I'm a big believer in that one person philosophy. If things are going really bad for you, who's that one person you're going to reach out to? I don't care who it is. I don't care if it's their neighbor. I don't care if it's a family member. I don't care if it's a professional. Who's the person they're going to go to? Our example with Jason. Who's Jason going to go to? Does he have a buddy in NA he can go to, or a sponsor that he can go to and say, oh man, my job didn't work out, and find a healthy place to vent all that frustration, so that eventually he can deal with all those feelings and then move to the point of, okay, now what am I going to do, from here? There's a place where we need to process all those feelings before we can take our next action.
Any other questions or comments? Any thoughts on one resource or one thing that Ken talked about today that you can use in the next couple of weeks or implement into your current work? Maybe you can use the chat, identify what's one tool, resource, something that Ken mentioned that you can use in your work over the next month or kind of ongoing. having this sort of implementation discussion at the end is helpful to hear your colleagues and what they plan to do, kind of get a sense of how to sort of take this information and use it in your own work. So if you want to put it in the chat, or if you want to just think about what is that one thing, resource, tool, support Ken mentioned that you can implement into your own work.
Yeah, next step.
Yes, Jesse, the presentation and the resources will be sent. Kelly, good suggestion of viewing it as a symptom of other issues. Emma, starting to use the Columbia during intakes, at least ask the questions on the suicide if we feel there may be a high risk. I think it would be Marilyn, I think it would be beneficial to use the Columbia inventory more often during the intake. Great. Wait, I like the team approach.
I'll throw in one more plug about the Columbia. The first time I used it in the state hospital, we were getting ready to discharge someone, and this is someone who had a long history of severe, potentially lethal suicide attempts, including just jumping out in front of cars by the side of the road. And so I volunteered to do the Columbia with him because I was familiar with the tool, and then his psychologist and another psychologist sat in the room. So we did it with him, and the funny part was the client actually learned something about himself through the discussion of, because he talked about, he brought up his past attempts, and we talked about what his past attempts were. And then he made the connection that every time he's discharged from the hospital, he tries to go back to his family rejects him, and then he attempts suicide again. So when we were done, he finished and he left the room, and me and the two psychologists sat in the room together, and we're like, well, I think he learned something. I think he learned something about himself through all this. And I felt like we learned something about him as well. So I think we lifted the lid on a taboo subject, and that made it okay for him to think about it. And he actually made a pretty important connection of, maybe I shouldn't just get out of the hospital and then try to make everything okay with my family. Maybe that's not the first thing I need to do. So we didn't expect to get that out of the experience, but it was very helpful.
Then we have a couple more comments. I like the team approach with most mental health participants and always having an emergency contact, Emily mentioned.
Definitely. Good point.
Yep.
Yeah, who's that go to? I don't care who they are, just that they are.
I don't see any more comments or questions coming in, Ken. Kati, I think maybe we're at the point for the evaluation and providing any feedback.
Yes, thank you, Joni, and thank you, Ken, for providing us with this webinar today. As Joni mentioned, we do have an evaluation component, and as a federally funded technical assistance and training center, we are required to evaluate all of our training events and products. So on your screen, if you do have a QR code, you can either hover over and take our short evaluation survey there, or I can also share in the chat box the link to the same evaluation survey. We will also share the link to the recording of this webinar, which will be posted on our website within a week. And also our presenter slides will be available to you on our webpage within a week of today. So just in case you haven't seen them or you haven't received them from me, you will receive the link within a week. Also, you will receive a certificate of completion for today's event for 1.5 hours of professional development. If you don't see that, please let me know. We'll put my email in the chat box. And also all of any questions related to CRC credits, please direct them to ACCES-VR, and they will be handling that as well. And that is all I have to share on evaluation and our next steps. I'll turn it back to Joni. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ken. We added in our PowerPoint presentations, a podcast that some of our colleagues are currently conducting and doing. It's called Flourishing at Work, a plan for helping professionals. You can search it on Spotify, Apple Music, Podbean, really good information for providers to flourish at work. Talks about wellness and other self-care strategies for providers of services for individuals. So check it out. And then connect with our center in certain through our website, Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn. You'll have these presentation materials, like Kati said. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ken, so much for your information.
Nice meeting all of you. Thank you for what you do. We appreciate it.
Great.
Thank you, everyone, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Be well.
Thank you.